Is your team not performing well? Is morale low and turnover high? Are you falling further behind the competition? I'm here to help. I'm your host, Shani, and this is the LeaderShifter Show, where business strategy and culture finally meet, and we make the long-awaited shift from rhetoric to results. I promise I'm not your typical boring leadership consultant, and I will help you get your shift together. Let's do this. Hey, LeaderShifters, and welcome to another episode of the LeaderShifter Show with yours truly, Shani. I cannot wait for you to meet today's guest, Dr. Adia Gooden. She's a clinical psychologist, and I've been wanting to have her on the show ever since I saw her TED Talk. The TED Talk is called Cultivating Unconditional Self-Worth. So for those of you who've struggled with imposter syndrome, no matter how successful you get, no matter how much you've achieved, this episode is for you. And I am personally so passionate about Dr. Gooden's work that I am going to name it right here, right now. She's the Brene Brown of Unconditional Self-Worth. So Dr. Gooden, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate that introduction, and I will take a positive comparison to Brene Brown any day.
Right? She is awesome.
She is.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to study, because your undergrad was in psychology at, was it Stanford or some university like that, right? And then you have a PhD also in clinical psychology from DePaul University in Chi-Town.
Yeah.
So what stirred your interest in that field?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's sort of two primary things. One is that I've always been interested in people. I have always been a people person. I've always loved people. And, really had a desire to be accepted and affirmed and to also help other people. That's been something that I've been passionate about since I was a kid and, wanted to understand what troubles people, what makes life hard for people, and wanting to do something to change that. So that has always been with me. And I, as all people do as they're growing up, I sort of was looking in different ways and thinking about, well, how would I do that, right? What's the best fit for me to help people? So that was sort of one part of my journey to being a psychologist. But another big part is that both of my parents are actually clinical psychologists, which is kind of unusual. And, they never pushed me.
Those must have made for fun dinner conversations.
Yeah, serious. I've always asked a lot of questions and, been a good listener probably because of them. They're great listeners. But I think, I saw them as having a model for what it can look like to have a profession where you're helping people, where you're intellectually curious, where you're studying, and they never pushed me, right? They were never like, you should be a psychologist when you grew up. It was just that my interests aligned with something that they had done. And so it made sense. It was a good fit for me to follow in their footsteps in a lot of ways.
Nice. Okay. And then specifically, why did you start to dig into this idea of self-worth and self-esteem and self-acceptance? There's a lot of fill in the blanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has really come both from my personal experience of struggling with low self-worth for years. I wouldn't have been able to name it as such, but I was anxious. I was a perfectionist. I put a ton of pressure on myself to try to be perfect so I could be loved and accepted, to try to get the best grades so that I would feel worthy and like I was good enough and like I was lovable. And I, really searched for my self-worth in a lot of different ways throughout my years, throughout my, childhood, teenage years, and young adulthood. And, none of it ever really worked. It worked for a little bit, but it didn't really stick.
Right.
And then
being a perfectionist is the surest way not the short, is certainly a way to be unlovable by others.
Well, that's a challenge, right? Like trying to be perfect isn't actually the path to love and acceptance.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I had those personal experiences. And then once I was, practicing as a therapist, I started working at one of the top universities in the country at their counseling center. And so I was working with these very high achieving, very smart students. And what I was seeing was similar things that I had experienced, right? So despite getting into this top university, they still didn't feel worthy. They were pushing themselves. They were overworking themselves. They were perfectionists, and they were struggling with these same things. And it was through that and through my sort of own personal journey that I realized that the underlying issue was a feeling of low self-worth. The core problem for so many, I can't say 100%, but for many people was, I don't feel worthy. No matter what I do, I don't feel worthy. And so then I drink, or then I do drugs, or then I procrastinate, or then I overwork myself, right? And so I started to sort of explore this idea of self-worth, of worthiness, of unconditional self-worth as this core thing that was underlying so many things, that if we could get people to feel worthy, then all the rest of their life would start to feel so much better.
Right. Okay. Differentiate for us between self-esteem and unconditional self-worth.
Yeah. So self-esteem is sort of based on how we are showing up in the world in an outward doing sort of way. So it's based on our abilities and accomplishments, on the things we believe we can achieve, right? And it goes up and down depending on our performance, right? So you might have high self-esteem if you just aced a test, if you just got a promotion, if you just did really well on a presentation, and low self-esteem if you made a mistake, if you faltered, if you experienced a failure, if you lost a job. It is possible to have high self-esteem and low self-worth, right? So be really confident, like, I know I can do this thing very well at work, but still have an underlying feeling of I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, or if any mistake happens, I'm definitely not worthy, right? In contrast, our self-worth is based on how we feel about ourselves and how we treat ourselves. And I define unconditional self-worth as the belief that you deserve to be alive, to be loved and cared for, and to take up space just because you're worthy, not because you accomplished something, not because you look a certain way, not because this or that, but because you're human, right? That you deserve these things as a human being, and then you treat yourself that way because you believe you're worthy.
Yeah, like the inalienable rights, to take it from the Constitution, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay, now as I'm listening to you distinguish between the two, what's coming up for me is maybe that's why people haven't cracked the code yet on imposter syndrome, and why people who are such high achievers still doubt themselves and will identify as having imposter syndrome. So how do you overlay your work into that concept?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think low self-worth certainly leads to imposter syndrome, or we can think of imposter syndrome as a manifestation of low self-worth or conditional self-worth. If I meet these conditions, then I'll feel good. But if I don't, then I won't. And the problem is when you put like perfectionism in there, that it's basically never perfect. So you never feel it's good enough. So you always feel like an imposter, right? And what I have found in my work, I actually do a lot of speaking on imposter syndrome, and I've done it with, law professors and women surgeons. And what I see in that is the achievement isn't the way out of imposter syndrome. So that's what we think. If I just achieve this next thing, if I just get the promotion, I get the raise, I do this, I do that, right? Like I graduate, I get the degree. then I won't feel like an imposter. But the reality is that achievement doesn't solve imposter syndrome. The thing that helps us to feel less like imposters is believing that we're worthy, right? Is sort of getting out of that cycle of achievement and saying, you know what, I'm worthy regardless. And I can bolster my skills. I can get better at this. I can learn. But that's not dependent on my worthiness, right? Because what happens is when we know we're worthy, we have this foundation that we can then go into a situation and say, okay, how can I learn? How can I grow? How do I want to show up? Instead of feeling unworthy and going into work and academic situations saying, how can I prove myself? Am I going to get it right? Are they going to accept me? Are they going to, right? Like all of that anxiety because we feel like we have to prove ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I see sort of the connection between these two things.
So it's almost like unconditional self-worth is the opposite of ego in some ways. Like,
yeah, right. It's not about proving, right? So if ego is about how do people see me and how do I get people to see me in a better way and all of that stuff, right? This outward stuff. Self-worth is about the inner stuff. It's how do I see myself? How do I treat myself? How do I honor my humanity regardless of what is happening and what I am doing in the world?
Right, because when you have that sense of self-worth, then you're not afraid to ask the questions, to admit you don't know everything, to ask for help, which is where a lot of leaders stumble. They feel like, oh, I can't look like I don't have all the answers. Oh, I can't look like I can't do this on my own. And that's why I say it's like not really the opposite of ego, but maybe it's like the antidote for ego.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's right. It's not seeing your worth as being dependent on your performance. I think that when people are oriented more towards process, it's easier to let go of imposter syndrome, because imposter syndrome is about performing and proving, right? And if you're a leader and you're in performance mode, that's a challenge. But if you're in process mode, if you're thinking about how do I want to show up? What does it look like to show up as a leader with integrity, as someone who's thoughtful, as someone who can problem solve, as someone who's supportive of my team? You can do all of those things without being perfect.
Yes.
And the reality is that you're actually going to be a better leader because you also are giving your employees, your supervisees, permission to make mistakes, to ask questions, to learn, to grow, to talk, to collaborate, instead of you trying to be perfect. Then your employees think they have to be perfect and everybody's running around anxious trying to be perfect. And nobody's really talking to each other about the process, how we're showing up with and for each other. And so it actually makes for better teamwork if the leader says, hey, I made a mistake. I'm still learning. I want your feedback. That actually creates an environment of growth, learning, and progress that's going to be much more effective than everything's perfect. Everything's got to be perfect. Nobody can make a mistake, which is very stressful.
Absolutely. And, all of this relates to how to create psychological safety in the workplace or, really in any group of people. That's a prerequisite to real innovation and success and growth and all those things. And it's so hard for leaders to really understand how to do that. And part of the how is you have to be that before you can encourage it on the team. So let's go there. How do you do it? I know you have 4 steps that you typically recommend for going through that process of getting in touch with your own unconditional self-worth.
Yeah. So, I think, the first big one that I talk about a lot, especially with my clients, is being there for yourself or practicing self-compassion, right? And that really relates to psychological safety, right? Often our own internal space, our mental space is not safe.
That's right.
Because any mistake gets this harsh criticism. Oh my God, I can't believe you did that. You're so stupid. You made a mistake and and now you're going to lose your job. You're going to be home, right? Like all of that inner criticism is so exhausting. And you're right. And it's funny, right? People laugh because everybody's like, oh my God, yeah, that person's in my head too. Right.
Right. I know, I forget who said it. I don't know, it was Gary Vee or one of those people said something about like going into his head is like going into a really unsafe neighborhood.
Yeah. It's like being assaulted on every side.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, how do you start to dial that back? How do you start to be a friend to yourself, to be kind to yourself, right? And so I talk a lot about the practice of self-compassion, which is really just responding to yourself with curiosity, with kindness, reminding yourself that you're human and that you have not made this horrible mistake that nobody else has made before. Like just offering yourself this kindness and compassion, because it's from that space that we can make thoughtful decisions about how to clean up a mess or how to fix something or how to move forward, right? We think that the criticism is moving us forward, but it really is holding us back.
Absolutely. Okay. So step one, leader shifters, you've heard me talk about this before, and I love the way Adia just framed it. So, okay, step two.
That's forgiving yourself, right? So many of us hold on to past mistakes, past failures, right? Whether that's a personal mistake or failure or a career mistake or failure. And we say, this is the reason I'm unworthy. This is the reason I can't succeed. This is, right? Like we sort of hold ourselves back, right? And I say that when we don't forgive ourselves, it's like packing a backpack. Oh, this mistake, that failure, this mistake, right? Put it all in your backpack and put it on you and walk around with it all day. Maybe take a hike with it, right?
Right. And boy, does it get heavy as you age.
It gets heavy, right? And we don't have to do that, right? So the process of self-forgiveness allows us to transform past pain, past mistakes, past failures into wisdom. And we can carry the wisdom with us. The wisdom isn't heavy. The wisdom helps us to avoid making the same mistakes. And we are allowing ourselves to say, okay, that happened. I'm going to let myself move forward, right? I'm not going to say, well, I had this big failure early in my career, so now that's haunting me, right? You can choose to say, well, what did I learn from that? I learned that I need to think before I send emails. I learned that I need to ask questions when I don't know something. I learned that I need to collaborate instead of trying to do everything myself. Okay, that is the wisdom. I'm taking that wisdom forward. I'm learning from it, and I'm letting the mistake, I'm letting the failure go.
Like even hearing you talk about it, like my shoulders dropped, because we carry around these metaphorical loads. And it is our choice to keep carrying that or to exchange it for the lightness of the wisdom. Gosh, what a fabulous analogy.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the third practice is practicing self-acceptance, right? So often, I think this particularly manifests as in imposter syndrome. We're comparing ourselves to others. We are thinking, I need to be just like them in order to be successful, right? We're saying, oh, they ask the best questions. I don't ask those questions. What's wrong with me? Oh, they do that, right? Like, and we do this comparing. But the reality is that really we need to be ourselves in order to be most successful, right? There's research that shows that diverse teams, right? Diverse in a number of different ways, people from diverse backgrounds, different ways of thinking, different abilities, all of those things. Diverse teams produce the best outcomes.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yes. And we don't get to take advantage of the richness of diverse teams if everybody is trying to be like everybody else. right? So we need people who think differently, who have different ideas, who ask different questions. We need everyone to be themselves, right? And that is what accepting yourself is, right? It's looking for acknowledging your unique strengths, perspectives, and gifts, and owning that. So instead of focusing on, oh, this is what's wrong with me, I'm deficient in this area, I'm not good enough at that, it's focusing in on, what do you do well? What can you bring? What can you offer? What can you share? And showing up in that way instead of in a way of thinking I'm not good enough.
Okay, so it sounds like one of the keys to unlocking diversity is for everyone on the team to feel psychologically safe, to be themselves, and then their diversity of thought will come out a lot more freely rather than them holding it back. Because I see this happening all the time. People think that diversity exists just because you can see it. No.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity, that kind of diversity, is superficial. It's what's inside all of the diverse faces that we see is where the true juice of the diversity lives.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, for leaders, since, your podcast is focused on leaders, it's really about intentionally making space for people from diverse backgrounds to share their thoughts, ideas, and opinions, because the dominant voices tend to be the voices of the people who have the most privilege, who historically have had the most power. And they're going to be the ones, they're people who usually are affirmed their whole life that the world wants to listen to you, the world wants to hear you. And the people from underrepresented groups, women, right, have been told their whole life, be quiet down, take up less space, right? And so it's the job of leaders to actively create space, right? To tell those people who are more loud and outspoken, not to be silent, but to say, hey, hold back a minute. Hold on a minute. We want to hear from the other people, and to say to the people who may be less likely to speak up as quickly, hey, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your ideas. You are here for a reason, and we value your opinion. So there's this intentionality that leaders can use to create a space where everyone is not only sitting at the table, but their voice is heard. There's room for it.
Absolutely. Yes. And that bears repeating. Leaders, it is your job. It is your responsibility to foster that on your teams. You have to set the tone. And once you do, and you make it part of your team culture to invite people to speak who don't normally speak, then other people will follow suit. So it is your job. It's one of your key jobs, and it's one of the ways we're gonna fix all the things that are broken right now.
Yeah.
Okay. And last step of your 4.
Last step is connect to supportive people. So low self-worth and imposter syndrome really leave us feeling sort of isolated and alone. We usually feel like we are the only ones. Everybody else is wonderful and amazing. We're the only ones who are unworthy, unlovable, not good enough. And that causes us to pull away and to hide, right? Because the fear is, if I tell someone how I'm feeling, they might say like, yeah, you don't really belong here, or you're not really worthy, right? That's the fear. And so we sort of isolate and we pull away, and that just makes us feel worse. In contrast, when we can connect to supportive people, when we can reach out and say, hey, I'm struggling with some imposter syndrome, or I'm not feeling great today. And we can have people say, oh my goodness, like that comment you made in that meeting the other day was so incredible. And it really got me thinking. And now I got out of a rut with my project, or whatever it is. Or, even if it's not talking about low self-worth specifically, just having the experience of somebody supporting us, showing up for us, showing care for us, affirming us, can remind us that we're worthy, right? And so allowing ourselves to let that in is really powerful and important.
This, it's sort of coincidental in my newsletter just last month. So in my newsletters, I try and end with an inquiry for leaders, something to think about, an open-ended question. And last month's question was something to the effect of, who in your network or in your inner circle can you truly rely on, to be honest with you when you don't want a bunch of yes people around you, and who in your network can you rely on to sit with you when you're down and help bring you back up. Like, those are such important roles for people to have in their lives, and not everybody has them. Like, I am so lucky, fortunate, blessed, fill in the blank. I have a group of friend, family, colleague combos. Like, I think of them as all three, that we call each other our pit crew, because we can't run life's race without them.
Nice.
Not that I'm a big NASCAR person, but it just is the analogy that we use.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's so important. And I think especially for leaders, right? Because when you are a leader, by nature of kind of how organizations can be set up, it can be sort of isolating, right? Because you may have peers in your organization, or you may not work directly with them, right? And your employees may not be giving you all the honest feedback because you have more power than them, and that can get tricky. And so having people that you can go to and say, hey, I'm struggling, or hey, I'm not sure about this, who can give you reassurance and can give you honest feedback, is so important.
I love it. You mentioned something earlier that I made a mental note to pin, and I'm going to unpin it now, which is that a lot of times women in particular are harder on themselves. And, I'm sure you've seen some of the research that says women will, on average, only apply for a job if they think they're 90% qualified, or whatever the number is, whereas a lot of similarly experienced men will apply for a job where they only meet, say, 50% of the criteria and not think anything of it. So in your work and in your research, do you see a difference in these levels of unconditional self-worth between men and women?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mostly work with women. So I do have some male clients, but I would say, but I don't have a good, perfect comparison group. But I will say, I do think it's stronger in women. I just think there are a lot of things that women are punished more for, right? Like, we're punished more if our appearance isn't in line with the mainstream norms. We're punished if we seek leadership roles, or if we are confident, right? Like, there are just, it sort of feels like there are more, like, it's a minefield. It can be a minefield as a woman, and there are more hidden mines, right? Like, it's not that men don't have any mines on their field, right? It's not that they are just like, they can do whatever, but it just feels like there's much less grace for women. And I think that because of that, and also I think women tend to be oriented and socialized to be more social, to need more acceptance and want more acceptance, which can be such a healthy thing, to be connected and in a group. But the idea of rejection, or the prospect of rejection, or being left out, or that, I think feels more painful or scary for women than it does for men often. And so, I think that combination, right? So both being more likely to be punished for a lot of different things related to appearance, related to speaking and confidence and taking on leadership roles, all of these things, and the deep desire to be connected and in the group, I think that can create a sense of more pressure, putting more pressure to be accepted, to get it right, to do it perfect, to be nice while doing it, right? There's all of these pressures that
not
can
too aggressive.
Right. Be confident and assertive, but not too aggressive, but make sure you're nice, but set boundaries. But like, there's all of these things that can result in women experiencing more stress, being more harsh and critical of themselves, putting more pressure on themselves. And so I think that's part of the reason why we see some of those gender differences.
Yep. Okay. And while we're on the subject of differences and groups that just aren't in the power seat, I noticed on your website that you've recently written an article and done some speaking on how your work can help people deal with microaggressions. If you could share some tips there, because I mean, they're happening daily all over the place.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's, microaggressions are challenging, right? They're challenging because they often leave the person who experienced them questioning, like, was that a micro? What, like it's sort of, because it's usually not, by the nature of the definition, it's not the in your face, you're a woman, you're a Black person.
Intentional.
Right. It's this like little dig where you're like, why did they say that? Was that because I'm a Black woman, etc.? So there's the stress of questioning and just trying to figure it out. Then there's the stress of, what do I do about it? Do I want to say something? If I say something, will this person be receptive and hear me? Will they be defensive? Will they retaliate? Will they judge me? Will they say I'm over exaggerating? Right. So then there's this whole, am I going to do anything about it? Right. And then, then there's also this concern, which I focus on a lot, is the internalization, right? Maybe there is something wrong with me and how I communicate and who I am because this person is treating me that way. And so one of the things I talk a lot about is depersonalizing the microaggression and the discrimination you experience, right? So, for example, I'm very clear that, as a Black woman, there are a lot of messages that I'm not good enough, that I'm not worthy, that I'm not smart enough, right? Those messages, there's a lot, right? But what I am clear about is that being a Black woman is not the problem. The problem is that we have racism and we have sexism and we have these challenging systems of oppression that we are still working to dismantle. But depersonalizing that is so important, because if I start to think maybe I'm the problem, then I'm starting to internalize this idea that there's something wrong with being a Black woman, that I am the problem. It doesn't take away some of the pain and the stress, but at least if I can say, oh, that's the problem of this person has racist views or biased views or this system, then it's not on me, right? Then it's like, okay, I get some space from it. And that really helps with coping with these challenges.
I love that. And we actually talk about that in team coaching sessions a lot, is let's separate the problem from the person or the people. Because, when you combine them, it's just a bloody mess.
Yes.
And we can do a whole nother podcast just on that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And I have one last question for you, which is, what was it like to do the TED Talk?
Oh, it was so good. I really enjoy public speaking. It's definitely a flow sort of state for me that I enjoy, but there's a process, right? So I applied to give the TEDx talk and then I was approved. And then for about 5 months, I worked on the talk. I got coaching. I practiced with friends, right? And then you memorize the talk. And then on the day of, it was just really exciting and invigorating to be able to do it. And so yeah, it was awesome. So I would say, if anybody's thinking about it, go for it. Find, a local, I know that TED has fellowships. I did a Tedx talk, but find a local organization or your university or, the university you attended and see if you can apply and do it, because I think it's an awesome way to get your message out into the world.
Cool. Well, I know it's more of a self-esteem booster, but it's still really impressive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it was great. And it's, opened up a lot of opportunities to speak on the same topic. And, we went over the 4 practices. I also have a free ebook on those practices.
You
So
just
if
beat
people
me
are
to
like,
it. I was going to say that.
I'm jumping in. Yeah, but if people are, like, oh, I'm curious to learn more, then I'm guessing we'll put the link in the show notes and people can sign up for the free ebook and just read a little bit more about some of these practices to help you on your self-worth journey.
For sure. Yeah, I was going to, in addition to pointing out that you have a free ebook on your website, I was going to also prompt you, what is your website and how can people reach you if they're interested in learning more or hiring you?
Yeah, so my website is dradiagooden.com. So dradiagooden.com. And yeah, there'll be a pop-up to sign up for the free ebook. And yeah, if you want to contact me, you're welcome to email me. Dr. Adia at dradiagooden.com. My contact is also on the website if people are interested in having me speak on one of these topics. And I have a course called the Unconditionally Worthy course. It's wrapped for the first time and will launch again early next year. But if this is something that you feel like you want to dig deeper into, make sure to sign up for that ebook. You'll get on my email list and you'll get encouragement along the way and then have the opportunity to join the course when it's open again.
Fabulous. And from one podcaster to another, you also have a podcast.
Yes, I have a podcast too. It's called Unconditionally Worthy. And so we talk about all of these topics: self-worth and imposter syndrome, and just how self-worth sort of impacts all these areas of your life. And I share my personal experience. I share practical strategies to support people on their self-worth journeys.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I just absolutely love your message, love your energy, and am so grateful that we were able to absorb some of it here on the LeaderShifter show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Of course. And LeaderShifters, before we sign off, I just want to make sure that you got some of the key nuggets from today. We're going to do a quick wrap here. So, achievement is not your way out of imposter syndrome. Stop trying to prove and start trying to unconditionally love, respect yourself to get to that place of unconditional self-worth. Because if you continue in that cycle of achievement, your ego will continue to get in the way of your success. And I know that one of the reasons you tune in is because you want to be a better leader. The other thing that is so standing out to me is that backpack analogy about like how much shit we carry around and how fucking, pardon my French, heavy it is to carry that around for years, decades, lifetimes. So let it go. And instead, what's the wisdom that came out of this experience? It's a hell of a lot lighter. And then, of course, all the things we touched upon in terms of like having that unconditional self-worth that allows you to be yourself, which adds so much more richness and texture to the workplace and to what you create and to your relationships. Like it's such important stuff. So thank you again, Adia, for joining us on the show. And thank you, LeaderShifters. Until next time.